After the heavy analysis of my last two videos, today's video will be more in the form of an update of the current situation, principally in Ukraine. I will touch briefly on some other topics as well. But briefly, and returning to the issue of Ukraine, I mentioned in yesterday's video that there appeared to have been some sort of Ukrainian counterattack in Bakhmut city, a counterattack which, however, appears to have failed, resulting in Ukrainian losses and Ukrainian forces being obliged to retreat, and with reports that the Russians, or to be more precise, the Wagner Group, which is this rather curious outfit of paid volunteer soldiers, that apparently they were able to gain some ground in Bakhmut city. Well, it's now clear, in fact, that there was a counterattack, a Ukrainian counterattack, or at least the Ukrainian army tried to launch counterattacks, not just in Bakhmut city, but in multiple places. There were counterattacks, apparently, in Bakhmut city, obviously, in Ugledar, further south, this important southern town, is southern Donetsk region town, which is seen by the Russians as important for the overall battle around Donetsk city, and also in the area around Kherson, in the Kherson region, with Ukrainian forces trying to launch an attack on Russian forces at a place called Vysokopolye, which, with the Ukrainians coming south towards these Russian forces from the town of Kryvyi Rog further north. Now, there may also, by the way, have been some kind of a counterattack in the Siversk area in northern Donetsk region. Now, it's been explained that all of these counterattacks, every one of which, by the way, appears to have failed with heavy losses, except possibly the one in Siversk, which may have recaptured a village called Grigorievka, but all of the other counterattacks appear to have failed, with the Ukrainians being thrown back after experiencing heavy losses. Now, I should say that, again, without having any special expertise in this area, I would have thought that counterattacks of this kind against superior forces, superior armed forces backed by artillery, which have entrenched themselves, are almost certain to result in very heavy losses, heavier losses than would have been the case if one had remained on the defensive, and all the indications are that that is precisely what happened. Now, this has been rationalized as part of a claim that General Zaluzhny, the commander or the chief of the Ukrainian General Staff, has supposedly persuaded President Zelensky to agree for Ukrainian forces to move over to something called active defense. Now, this idea is that instead of waiting behind in your trenches or your bunkers and your fortified locations, rather than do that and allow yourself to be relentlessly shelled, you go over instead to the attack and try to keep the enemy off balance by, attacking them. As I said, I think this is probably unwise. I think it's most likely going to result in higher Ukrainian losses than if the Ukrainians had stayed in their entrenchments. But then, of course, I'm not on the battlefields and I can't know for one way or the other. The overall result, however, is that all of these attacks appear to have been repulsed, except, as I said, that there does seem to have been some sort of Ukrainian gain in the Siversk area, where they recaptured this village of Grigorievka. But then, as I've said in many recent videos, the Russians appear to have downgraded the importance of Siversk as they've concentrated their offensive further south in the area opposite Donetsk city, clearing the fortified areas there, places like Pesky, Marinka, Avdiivka and the rest, and also obviously focusing heavily on the ultimate capture of Bakhmut city. Now, I'm going to add something further. The Military Summary channel, in its latest assessment of the situation, pointed out that rather unusually, the Russians didn't give, in one of their reports directly after these counterattacks, a breakdown of the Russian attacks on the various Ukrainian brigade formations. They didn't say which formations had been attacked. They didn't give estimates of the losses that these formations have suffered. The Military Summary channel said that this is the first time over the course of the war that the Russians have failed to do that in a summary, in a summary of the fighting over the previous day. I'm going to give a guess as to why that was. I suspect that it is linked to these Ukrainian counterattacks. I suspect that the Russians are still in the process, or were in the process when that summary was produced, of trying to work out what Ukrainian losses were as a result of those counterattacks, which formations had participated in them, how much the losses those Ukrainian formations had suffered. And given that, as I said, we've had all of these counterattacks all up and down the line, the front lines, it's perhaps unsurprising that this has taken a fair amount of time to do. Now, why did the Ukrainians launch all of these counterattacks? Was it because of this new active defense strategy which General Zaporozhie is supposed to have come up with? Well, it's possible. The General Zaporozhie has recommended some active defense strategy, though up to now it seems that his major recommendations have been not to attack, but to withdraw to more fortified or more defendable positions. So this might be something of a change of strategy by him. But, let's put that aside, because we don't know what advice he is giving to the Ukrainian High Command, to the President Zelensky, to the Ukrainian political leadership. I'm going to guess, to me, actually, these Ukrainian counterattacks have more of the appearance of desperation. The Ukrainians are clearly coming under intense pressure. They must be extremely worried that the situation opposite Donetsk city is turning out very bad for them, that they're being pushed back from their fortified positions in places like Pesky and Marinka. They must be worried that their major position in Avdiivka looks like it's in the process of being surrounded. It seems that they're also being driven out of their fortified positions around the Donetsk ring road. And last but not least, they must be also feeling the stress of their positions in Bakhmut city, which, as I've discussed in previous videos, appears to be the linchpin of the Ukrainian defenses in Donbass. So, given that this is so, given that they are under intense pressure, it's perhaps unsurprising that they've sought to relieve this pressure by launching these counterattacks. And they may have had another reason to launch these counterattacks, and that is that they must be increasingly worried that time is not on their side in this war. Now, a couple of weeks ago, a senior Ukrainian official I think it was Mikhailo Podolyak, but it might have been someone else, apparently, as I remember, said that Ukraine had 4 to 6 weeks in order to turn the situation round before the Russians consolidated their control of the areas of Ukraine that they had occupied. Well, those 4 to 6 weeks are passing, and the Ukrainians have not managed to reverse the direction of events. More seriously for Ukraine, the economic situation in Ukraine itself is getting worse. The economic situation in Europe is also getting worse, and this may be feeding into worries about the extent to which the European countries are prepared to continue giving their support to Ukraine. But perhaps the greatest worry of all may stem from this $3 billion US military aid package for Ukraine. Because as I've discussed, this was not actually a provision of aid directly to Ukraine. It was the US government placing orders with the military industrial complex for the production of more weapons, some of which might become available in several months, but some of which might not be available to supply to Ukraine for 3 years. And it's not, it seems to me, inherently implausible that the Ukrainians are concerned that these arms packages, this new arms package, which isn't really an arms package, actually signals a further decline in US support, actual military support for Ukraine. That what it means is that the US is not going to supply more weapons from its existing stocks to Ukraine, that Ukraine is going to be left hanging in the wind, trying to make do with whatever it has. And for that reason, the Ukrainians may feel that since they can't realistically wait 3 years, they have to do something now, something dramatic now, in order to regain the initiative. And that might be why they launch these counterattacks, all of which, as I said, partially from the one in Siversk, appear to have failed. And in fact, there's some information that gives us reasons to think that this might have been so. Yesterday, on the 25th of August, on the occasion of Ukraine's Independence Day, President Zelensky of Ukraine and President Biden of the United States had a telephone conversation. And it's clear that partly the reason of this call was for President Biden to extend congratulations to President Zelensky on Ukraine's Independence Day. But it's also interesting that the US readout contains these words. He, which is to say President Biden, reaffirmed the United States' continued support for Ukraine and provided an update on the ongoing provision of security assistance, including yesterday's announcement of nearly $3 billion to support Ukraine's defense capabilities for the long term. Now that looks to me as if an anxious Zelensky wanted to know from Biden, what does this defense package actually mean? Does it mean that you're no longer going to provide us with weapons now? Does it mean that the only weapons we're going to see are those which are going to come our way in perhaps 3 years' time? And it looks as if Biden tried to reassure Zelensky that it didn't mean the latter, that some more American weapons will be on their way sooner, and that the United States continues to support Ukraine. And it's interesting anyway that this exchange took place, so you can understand why the Ukrainians might be feeling nervous. Anyway, the long and the short of it is there were Ukrainian counterattacks. They all seem to have failed, and the Russians, having absorbed these counterattacks, seem to have actually gained ground near Bakhmut. There's some reports they've also gained ground near Ugledar, and the latest report suggests from the Russian Defense Ministry suggests that the Russians are also advancing towards a place called Novo-Mikhailovka, which is close to Donetsk city, and that the Ukrainian forces defending this place have apparently withdrawn, apparently because the Ukrainian soldiers who make up the formations that were defending this place, apparently they've decided that they've had enough and they're not prepared to go on fighting, and they're not prepared to die defending these places. So it looks as if these Ukrainian counterattacks have achieved absolutely nothing to change the course of the fighting. They've only probably resulted in more Ukrainian losses, instead. Anyway, returning to the overall situation, however, to what is actually going on not just on the battlefields, but in the political situation in Ukraine. Now, we've had some indications of what the Russians might be up to on the Nikolaev front, and it comes from Kirill Stromusov, who is the deputy head of the military-civilian administration which the Russians have set up in Kherson region. And he is reported to have said, he's reported by the Russian news agency TASS to have said the following, that the front line must be moved past the city of Nikolaev so as to make it fully possible to protect Kherson region. And Stromusov is reported to have said, perhaps it would have been worth it to bolster the air defense system, but this is the purview of the Defense Ministry of the Russian Federation. They know better what to do this in this case. I would certainly boast it. This is connected with the missile strikes, the HIMARS missile strikes on places like the Antonovsky Bridge and the Novaya Kakhovka Dam in Kherson region. And Stromusov says that it would be good if there were more air defences located in Kherson region to counter these HIMARS missile strikes. And then Stromusov goes on to say the strikes have not diminished. Lots of shells, in other words, HIMARS missiles, are being shot down, but some still reach their targets, damaging infrastructure, luckily insignificantly. I can say one thing for sure: it is better not to enhance the air defense, but to move the front line beyond Nikolaev and even further in order to make Kherson completely safe. Now, that is a comment from a Russian official, or at least an official operating within a Russian authority, a military civilian authority in Kherson region. Anyway, that particular official is now saying that the Russians should capture Nikolaev, if only in order to provide security for Kherson region. And that may be the first statement from a Russian official, or at least somebody within the Russian civilian military apparatus, which appears to confirm that the Russians do have their eye on the capture of Nikolaev. Now, yesterday, in his latest report, Dima of the Military Summary Channel gave us a long, detailed suggestion that a vast aerial armada of 150 helicopter gunships and 200 transport helicopters that Ukraine claims the Russians are concentrating near Ukraine's borders, that this huge aerial armada backed by fighter jets and bombers, Russian fighter jets and bombers, might be intended for some major advance towards Odessa, some huge deployment of paratroopers, something like 16,000 paratroopers or airborne troops to capture Odessa, or at least to encircle Odessa. In other words, to bypass Nikolaev and eventually, presumably, also capture Nikolaev, but also capture Odessa as well. And Dima, the military summary channel, linked this to this suggestion that, as I said, there's some sort of stability, as he put it, some sort of static situation on the front lines in Donbass, though Dima was very careful, the military summary channel was very careful to say that the Russians are still in fact actually making progress. It's just that the progress is slow and they could be looking for some rapid breakthrough, and this is what this huge aerial armada, this helicopter force that's supposedly been assembled, is all about. I have to say straight away, I don't actually think this is correct. I don't think that the Russians are planning some great coup de main of this kind to seize Odessa. I think much more plausibly, if what the Ukrainians are telling us is true, if these huge helicopter forces are being deployed, if the Russians are assembling a large amount of aircraft around Ukraine, that all of this is in preparation of the air assaults for the major Russian offensive, which I predict will come once the defense lines in Donbass are broken, and which will probably happen at some point within the next few weeks, and that this offensive is not to sweep into Odessa in this kind of dramatic way, but rather to support this Russian offensive towards the Dnieper River, and perhaps the encirclement and final destruction of the Ukrainian forces in Donbass. That looks to me much more plausible, and I suspect that all of these forces are going to be used, brought into action, once these defenses, these Ukrainian defenses in Donbass finally crack, once they're broken. And as I said, I don't think it's part of any strategy for some sort of strike towards Odessa. It doesn't make a great deal of sense to me, and it doesn't seem to me to be consistent with the way in which the Russians have conducted this war. Anyway, that's my view. I mean, the military summary channel, Dima has his, I have mine. We can each go our different ways on this. I would say that I think that the military summary channel has this idea that the Russians are working against the clock, that they're running out of time, when I see no sign of that. It seems to me, on the contrary, if anybody is worried about time issues, it is Ukraine. And statements from Ukraine have suggested this. Now, we've, by the way, on the subject of Russian operations and their incremental nature, as several people have pointed out to me, we've actually had comments from the Russian Defense Minister, Sergei Shoigu. And this has been widely reported in the West. It's including, by the way, by the the British Ministry of Defense, as explaining why the Russian advance has slowed. Except if we are looking at Shoigu's exact words, at least as they've been reported by the official Russian news agency TASS, Shoigu didn't say that the Russian advance has slowed. What he said was this: we strictly comply with humanitarian law during the special operation. Attacks are carried out with high-precision weapons on the Ukrainian armed forces' military infrastructure, facilities including command points, airfields, depots, fortified areas, and defense industry sites. At the same time, every effort is being done to prevent civilian casualties. It certainly slows down the advance, but we do it consciously. And Shoigu also complained that the Ukrainian armed forces employ scorched earth tactics, blatantly violate international law, act like terrorists. They establish firing positions in residential buildings, schools, hospitals and kindergartens, deploying tanks and artillery there and using civilians as human shields. They deliberately shell settlements and drop leper stock anti-personnel landmines with a clear goal to cause as much damage as possible to civilians and civilian infrastructure facilities. That's, of course, what Shoigu says. The Amnesty International report, which was published a short time ago, said something like the same thing. Now, what Shoigu is saying here is not that the Russian offensive has slowed. What he is saying is that the Russian offensive has always been slower than it might have been if the Russians had acted without regard to casualties, to civilian casualties. He stresses that they're advancing in strict compliance with international human rights law and international war crimes law, that they're extremely careful not to cause unnecessary casualties, and that inevitably has meant that their advance is slower than it would have been if they were acting indiscriminately. And he contrasts that with what he says is the behavior of the Ukrainian forces. Now, you can exercise a certain amount of cynicism about what Shoigu is saying here. I do up to a certain degree. I think that one of the reasons why Russian advance has been slower than it might otherwise have been is because the Russians have actually deployed relatively few forces to Ukraine. They've not sent in a 1 million-man army or anything like that, as, by the way, in theory at least, they could do. So there's relatively few forces. As I said, much of the fighting in Donbass is carried out by the infantry fighting is carried out by the Donbass Militia, and it is perhaps this lack of infantry that is partly the reason for the relatively incremental nature of the Russian advance, as of course is dealing with these very heavy fortifications that the Ukrainians have built up in this area. But having said that, one shouldn't discount what Shoigu says completely. Now, I've had a rather interesting email, private email again, from someone in Russia. And he obviously was inspired to say this, to write this to me, in response to my last video. And he makes the following point, and it is a good one. He says, I am Russian, and I want to point out a vital fact in understanding of the Russian government's behavior, attitude towards common Ukrainians, and avoidance of inflicting any harm on them. The Russian army behaves in the way that it does, not only because of world public opinion. We in Russia see Ukrainians not even as a brother nation. We believe that in fact we are one nation. That, by the way, is something that Putin repeatedly says. The Ukrainian population is our own. We have not only centuries-old cultural, economical, and historical ties, literally they are our relatives. It is hard to find an ethnic Russian family who doesn't have at least some kind of relatives in Ukraine. As for myself, my mother is of Ukrainian origin from the western Ukrainian city of Rivne. And the army, it consists of people who also have relatives there. After 2014, many Ukrainians fled to Russia, to the Donetsk and Lugansk People's Republic, saving themselves from the new government. Some of them were servicemen. I'm not even speaking about Crimea. They're now fighting there as well against the Ukrainian army, or their children who grew up for this 8 years and have become professional servicemen. So when Putin speaks about the fact that Russians are not in the war with Ukrainians, he didn't lie. The goals of the special operation are not lies, but those which were declared. They're crystal clear for Russians. It is the purging of Ukraine from the ideology that has taken root there. And he says that this may sound naive, but it is in fact how most Russians see the situation. Now, I don't think you can discount this. I think there is a great deal of truth here. And bear in mind that if we're talking about the militia, the Donbass Militia, of course they're fighting on the territory of Donbass. So these towns like Bakhmut and Kramatorsk and Slavyansk and Siversk and wherever, where the Ukrainians are embedded, these are places local to themselves, where people they probably know and are connected to and maybe even closely related to, are where all these people live. So it's understandable that there is a revulsion in Donbass and probably in all of Russia against inflicting casualties against a population, a Ukrainian population, which is so interconnected by familial and other factors with Russia itself. I don't think one should discount this. Sometimes an excess of cynicism can lead one in the wrong direction. Now, a number of other things. Firstly, whilst talking about the Russian army, there was an announcement yesterday that President Putin has issued a decree increasing the size of the Russian army to 2,039,758 servicemen, from 1,902,758. In other words, an increase of 137,000 men. Now, I want to say this clearly, this has nothing to do with some of the things that have been suggested. It is not about the fighting in Ukraine, and it is not about the spring conscription drive that some people have been talking about. What is happening is that Russia has been steadily increasing the number of professional soldiers in the Russian army, the Russian armed forces. I understand that there's something like 352,000 full-time professional soldiers in the Russian army, Russian military, combined with 270,000 commissioned officers and warrant officers. And the plan is to increase that number of contract servicemen by 2025 to 475,000. So you can see that this build-up of Russian forces that Putin has announced, this decree, is consistent with the increase of the Russian armed forces that was planned way back in 2018. It's the to the size that we are now seeing, and the way that's going to be done is by increasing the number of full-time service personnel. So this reporting on this topic has been something of a red herring. Now, there's been some rather curious commentary in parts of the media in the West about the Zaporozhie nuclear power station. There's continued insistence that this is all somehow being shelled by the Russians themselves. Perhaps the biggest story is that the Russians have now carried through on what appears to have been a long-standing plan to disconnect the Zaporozhie nuclear power station from Ukraine's electricity grid. That's going to reduce the electricity supply to Ukraine by 20%. Now that's a dramatic development, economically speaking, and unsurprisingly, it's perhaps something which the Russians had previously indicated that they were minded to do, and it may be that this was one of the reasons why the Ukrainians have been shelling the nuclear power station. They've been trying to regain some kind of operational control over it because they've been worried that it was going to be disconnected from their electricity grid, which is what, of course, has now happened. So that's an important development. I think it's a done thing. I think from now on, Ukraine is going to have to make do with less electricity. This as winter approaches. And of course, winter approaching is creating economic problems in many Western countries. I've just seen news all over the media here in Britain that in October, our energy costs in Britain are going to increase by 80%. This comes on top of the 57% increase that took place in April, and there's going to be another further increase apparently in January. So this is already a dire situation in Europe. And of course this is leading to concerns about the war of economic attrition that's been waged by the West against Russia. We've had growing worries about this, and a very interesting comment from The Economist, from Zanny Minton Beddoes, who's apparently the editor-in-chief of The Economist, this British journal, which has always taken a rigidly anti-Putin position. It says that 6 months ago, Russia invaded Ukraine. On the battlefield, a war of attrition is underway. Our cover this week is about the other struggle raging over Ukraine, an economic conflict of a ferocity and scope not seen since the 1940s, as Western countries try to cripple Russia's economy with a novel arsenal of sanctions. The effectiveness of this embargo is critical to the outcome of the Ukraine war, but it also reveals a great deal about liberal democracy's capacity to project power globally into the late 2020s and beyond, including against China. Worryingly, so far, the sanctions war is not going as well as expected. Now, that is a massive understatement. Russia's economy is still functioning. In fact, it's stable. Whereas, as we see in the West, in Europe especially, there is now growing signs of an energy crisis. And it's very interesting to see The Economist saying that, this economic sanctions war that's been fought against Russia, its failure may undermine future Western action against other countries globally and beyond, including against China. So you can make of that what you will. Now, that, of course, is consistent with the fact what I was saying in my program yesterday. The West is losing the economic war. Ukraine is losing the military struggle. A debacle is gradually, ever so gradually, emerging over this war in Ukraine. And as the editor-in-chief of The Economist ever so grudgingly admits, this debacle threatens to have a global impact. Well, since I'm talking about global affairs, it's perhaps as well to say that this isn't the only thing that's happening in the world. There's been reports that Azerbaijan has captured more territory in Nagorno-Karabakh The Armenian president telephoned and spoke to President Putin on this matter. It's a matter that I think will concern the Russians a great deal. I should say the Armenian prime minister, not president. And we also have heard that Saudi Arabia is angry that the United States is again thinking about some sort of rapprochement with Iran. And it's apparently indicated to the United States that if sanctions, oil sanctions on Iran are lifted, allowing free flow of Iranian oil, then Saudi Arabia will cut production. So lots of things going on. But overall, in Ukraine, a continuing deterioration of the overall situation, at least as far as the West is concerned. Ukrainian counterattacks, which have failed, Ukraine's loss of 20% of its electricity supply, a steady Russian build-up around Ukraine, aircraft now deployed, helicopters deployed. All the indications are of a major Russian offensive pending. And admissions, even in places like The Economist, that the war of attrition, the economic war of attrition, is not going as well as expected. Well, I expressed my views about what should be done in my long video yesterday about the need to talk peace. At some point, I expect someone will act on that, but I suspect that things have to get a lot worse before anybody in the West, at least anybody of importance, does it. Anyway, that's my rundown for today, my summary of events for today. Remember, you can find us on other platforms, Rumble, ODYSEE, Locals, above all, Telegram. You can also support us via Patreon and Subscribestar. Remember that you can go to our shop, buy the great things that you will find there. And last but not least, if you've liked this video, please remember to press the like button and to check your subscription to this channel. Thank you for joining me again today. I look forward to you joining me again soon, and have a very good day until then.